we'd like to talk about preparing dry beans and peas. And this is a very inexpensive way to prepare them ahead of time, and you can save them for later use. And that way you don't have to worry about cooking them up every time you want to use them. The first thing that you want to do when you open up a bag of beans is inspect them. They do come directly from the field, so you might find some surprises in the bag.
Just like some rocks?
Like some rocks.
Bad beans?
And bad beans. And this is just some examples of some shriveled up beans or some that have some bad colored spots on them. The cracked open beans like this. So you want to take those out. You want to use the best quality beans. And you want to do the same thing with the lentils too. And then after that, we're ready to soak them. And you want to use, for every 1 pound of bean, you want to use about 10 cups of water. When they get soaked, they're going to expand at least 2 to 3 times their original size. So the important thing about soaking them is it helps remove a sugar that's in beans, which is called oligosaccharides. And this sugar is what produces gas that some people have problems with. So by soaking, that helps pull that sugar out and removes it, and then they'll be a little more friendly to you. So the easiest way to soak them is to put them in a large saucepan and bring them to a boil and simmer them for about 2 to 3 minutes. Then you take it off the heat, leave them set in that water, and you let them soak for a minimum of 4 hours. Or you can even leave them set overnight or even up to 24 hours. After the soaking is done, drain them, and then you want to add fresh water and then continue to cook them. And this may take an hour, it may take 2 hours, it depends on the size of the bean. One thing is, if you have older beans, if you've had a bag of beans in your cabinet for a long time, they're going to take longer to cook and they'll be pretty firm. So if you find that they're just not going to get soft, that's why, is because they're an older bean. The other thing when you're cooking them is you don't want to add salt to them. Salt will also keep them firm.
Might be a good idea when you buy your dried beans to date them, and so you have a date on your package. Then you have some idea of how long they've been in your cupboard.
That's a very good idea.
Great.
The other thing with lentils and split peas is that you do not need to soak those. Those are pretty much ready to use, and they only take about 20 minutes to cook. After you've cooked the beans and you drained them and you want to store them, you can store them in the refrigerator up to 5 days, or you can even split them into smaller packages and freeze them for up to 3 months.
So that's what makes them really a convenience food. If you have cooked dried beans, you can freeze them in amounts that are equal to 1.5 cups. That is the same amount of beans that is in a can that you would purchase at the grocery store, and oftentimes recipes will call for 1 can of beans. So 1.5 cups is what you need to substitute your cooked dried beans for that can.
All right, let's talk about canned beans and the different amounts of sodium that we might see.
We have an example here. This is just a can of beans that's been opened up and placed in a bowl, so you can see that it has a dark liquid. If you would include this liquid in your recipe, you would be getting 5/8 teaspoon of salt in this entire can of beans, or 1,275 milligrams of sodium. If you would rinse these beans before you use them, you actually eliminate 40% of the sodium. So this same amount of beans that's been rinsed would have 3/8 teaspoon of salt, or 777 milligrams. So there's a pretty good reduction there in the amount of sodium.
That's a significant amount.
If you rinse and drain those beans. Now if you want to go ahead and take it another step further and you cook the dried beans, and you use your cooked dried beans in that recipe, there's only a dash of salt in the 1.5 cups that replaced this can of beans. So a dash of salt, approximately 60 milligrams of salt in that version of cooked dry beans. So,
and that's just naturally in the beans.
It's naturally in the beans, and you really don't taste that as much as you think that you should. If you look at this amount of salt and think that's in a can of beans, you would think it would have a saltier taste than that. But the sodium's actually kind of hidden in the beans and in any canned vegetables that you have.
So how would you go about maybe sneaking in beans? A lot of people don't really care for them. So let's talk about some ways to sneak them in.
You can really sneak beans and legumes into lots of things. One that's pretty easy to do, and an example is to use the green lentils or a brown lentil and sneak that into spaghetti sauce. You would want to add a little bit of ground beef perhaps, but then extend it with some of your lentils. You can add beans or lentils to meatloaf. You can add them to a hamburger patty if you want to. You can also add it, of course, beans are sort of a staple ingredient in chili and lots of different soups. I like to just throw in a handful of legumes into a soup recipe. It just really kind of takes on the flavor of the soup and gives a little bit more texture and sometimes a little different color. You can also use beans, cooked beans, and puree them.
Yeah.
And use them like you would canned pumpkin or zucchini and adding them to recipes. What this does is it can be a fat replacer in some recipes. It also gives it a nice moist texture, adds some fiber, nutritional value to that recipe. So there are lots of things you can do to sneak them in.